Hi, I'm Jon Atack,
And I'm Michelle Haslam.
and we're going to talk a little bit about Michelle's background. And so perhaps if you could tell us something about your education, first of all.
Yeah, well, I spent a long time at uni,
Mhm.
10 years in the end, back to
10-year,
back.
10-year sentence.
Yeah. I did love it in some ways, but yeah. So studying psychology, and I specialised in eating disorders in an academic PhD, and then I went on to study clinical psychology, which you have to do placements in different areas of psychology, so it's more general. Um, and then when I started working, it was in an eating disorder service.
Mhm.
And I'd say, like I'd hinted before in the video that we made last time, that where we spoke about how actually there can be some cultic dynamics in universities. And yeah, I wonder if I was a little bit institutionalized and also used to the hierarchy and the structure, and perhaps not so skilled at making friends one by one in the outside world. Because like at university, you just turn up and everything's on the campus for most universities. So it's kind of like instant friends.
I think Ivan Illich's deschooling society, which has been with us since the 70s, is a very important idea still, that we tend to socially make institutions and groups that function in a certain way. Do you think that predisposed you to NKT?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think for several reasons. And I've spoken to some people who I never know whether to say joined or were recruited or whatever, but who became involved with the NKT straight out of university. And I think I sort of naively in my head saw it as a sort of spiritual university, one that was, yeah, where you were going to have friendships that incorporated more of you than you could maybe bring to university. And I think I was also, I never believed that in enlightenment, as I've said to you before, and I never sort of imagined what that would be like. But they do say in the NKT that if you practice diligently, you will achieve enlightenment within 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days. And that's quite an interesting
You should
time
have it in
frame.
writing.
Yeah, so I think...
Or your money back.
Oh, yeah, so many people would have a lot of money back by now. And I think that's interesting because that's also around the time that you would graduate from a degree.
3 years, 3 months, and 3 days. Yeah.
So that's quite interesting. Yeah, and I think I am a follower. Like, I like to just sort of turn up and mould into something that's already there. And perhaps I didn't learn some life skills that helped me to develop autonomy. I think university certainly contributed to that. Yeah.
So, as a clinical psychologist, that means that you would counsel people. And with eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, this sort of thing. What led you to NKT? What was the path to NKT?
Yeah, so I'd not long moved back into the country after living in America for a few months, and I'd lived in a sustainable community in Houston, which is a very strange combination of things, and it had kind of changed my life.
In Austin, I can see it. In Houston,
yeah, in Houston, it's odd, right? And it did kind of change my life because I really liked the communal meals element and the shared cooking and the sense of like an intentional community with some shared values. Sustainability was meant to be, the main value. So, so when I came back to the UK,
And when was that? What year? Were
That
we
was 2014, and I came back in March 2015.
Okay.
And I got a job in Northampton, and I lived in Northampton for a couple of years, I think. And I found it quite hard to make friends around my age, and I really missed living in a community. Even though it had its problems, but I liked the ethos, and yeah, I really liked. And I'd often lived in shared student houses where you were hanging around in your pajamas together, and I kind of like that. And then someone told me about the Buddhist Centre, and I went along to maybe only about 4 or 5 classes, I think. And I just remember finding it soothing. Like the general program classes it's a bit like multi-level marketing. The general program classes, and there's not so many warning signs in them. It's all about relaxation and stress management, and the only time that enlightenment's really mentioned is in the prayer at the beginning, but people don't talk about all the more scary bits like dissociating from the sense of yourself or the emptiness of your body or all those things. It's quite light, Buddhism light.
I mean, the introductory path for many people it's rapport building.
Yeah.
And this is a very gentle way of building a rapport without getting into the actual doctrine.
Yes, and it's interesting when you read the guide for teachers, and it says basically to keep it light, and it says people just need a place to come where they feel, supported. But actually, that the aim of the teacher is to drive the heart of the text to drive the meaning of the text into the hearts of the disciples. So, and it also says, be careful not to give the impression that it's a recruitment drive. Which
it is.
When you leave and you read that, you think, oh my God, It also says, give people a job because it makes them feel good about themselves, and then they'll come back, So, so I didn't really experience any warning signs, and because the buildings can be really beautiful in there in the middle of the countryside, it can be quite a serene sort of experience. And then I thought, I didn't at that time have any worries about Buddhism generally. I'd previously been interested. I'd done a couple of intro courses, but through Triratna, which used to be called the FWBO, not through NKT.
I'm sorry, what's that, Triratna?
It's another sect of Buddhism. Sangharakshita is the leader. He passed away last year.
Tradition?
I find it so difficult to understand because they make their own forms of it. So I hadn't read anything about abuse in Buddhism. I hadn't read any testimonies. I only thought Buddhism was good. Most Westerners think it's about peace and love and compassion. And I thought that practitioners would be taking quite a lot of self-responsibility. I didn't know anything about cultic dynamics, and maybe if I'd have studied more social psychology, I might have, but clinical psychology, there isn't so much of that. And even if you know lots of information, you may still get drawn in through your emotions,
I think that to use a psychological term, the fundamental attribution error applies also to psychologists. That I know that advertising works on other people, but it doesn't work on me.
We do tend to think we're not so susceptible, don't we? Yeah.
And that makes you more vulnerable.
Yeah. And it just didn't cross my mind that they would have any sort of agenda, really, And I thought, well, one day I'd like to live somewhere like that, but it's kind of a bit isolated, I think. And I kind of know that perhaps people aren't going to be terribly sociable because that's not really, if people are meditating a lot and, you don't...
You're not going to go down the pub and have a
drink. No. So, but then my mood dropped and I was heartbroken when I came back to the UK. I'd gone out to America for a relationship and it lasted 3 days. And that's why I ended up in that community, which kind of allowed me to stay a bit longer and have some support.
Yeah.
But I was too stubborn and ashamed to come straight home. Yeah, I'd sold my car, I'd rented out my house, I'd had a leaving party. Yeah, so, and I was totally destroyed with the sort of feeling of abandonment and betrayal, I guess. And I developed sort of quite severe culture shock, and then had quite severe reverse culture shock, which is an interesting experience, feeling like an alien in your own country. That's interesting. So this all sort of was triggered again, and my mood dropped, and I was actually struggling to cope without a sense of feeling part of a community. And I thought, okay, I think I need a bit more structure and routine and community. And I didn't feel able to reach out to my family and say I'm really struggling. I actually need a bit of support. And I didn't want to end up in an inpatient unit.
No.
So which may or may not have happened, who knows, but I was struggling to sort of even feed myself, you know, my mood was so low. And so I arranged to go and meet with the admin director at the Buddhist Centre. And the adverts that they make for residents, they sort of suggest that they're supportive spiritual communities, and that you will therefore be supported. And they don't really mention any of the possible difficulties, of course, that come along with that. And I hadn't read testimonies. So, to be fair to her, when I met with the admin director, she did say, you know, lots of people think that living here is going to make them happy, and then it doesn't, and then they're, you know, upset. But she said it in a way that sort of suggested they were spiritually inadequate. Like, it's because, you know, happiness is all in your mind, and if you try and look for it here, you won't find it here, rather than acknowledging that actually some quite disturbing stuff does occasionally happen here. So, and lots of people get, they move in when they're having a tough time after an experience of homelessness, financial difficulties, unemployment, because you can volunteer and live there for free. If you dedicate all of your hours to volunteering, you don't have to pay rent. And that, so a lot of people do that.
And how many of your hours would that be?
So if you're volunteering, it's full time. Because of lack of boundaries and work-life distinction, I think people work much more than that, because you haven't got privacy or boundaries, and it's difficult to say no when you're living in the place. You feel sort of obliged. But I still had my job, and so I only did about 5 hours a week and making beds and for the guests. And then I paid rent. And so some people live in the buildings and they do pay rent. And
what's the rent?
I think it was about 400 a month.
Okay.
I mean, lots of the NKT is known for benefit fraud, in encouraging people to claim benefits in order, who weren't previously claiming them, perhaps in order to keep the centres running.
We saw that in Scientology as well.
Yeah. So and so I moved in, and it was very blissful at first. You know, people talking about how the building had special energy, and there was a cafe where you could go and get a coffee, and you're like, oh, brilliant, it's like having an ensuite cafe. And people were always milling about, so there was always company. They may not really acknowledge you or spend any time with you or be interested in you, but people were around, you know. And then some people were really interested in you. And I think Matthew Remski writes about this. I can't remember if he's got a specific term for it, but it's when a group, if you're a scientist or a professional of some kind, you kind of get special treatment because you're sort of seen as validating the group's ideology. Like, oh, look, we've got a doctor here, or, you know. So I think they treated me like that, and
that is a sort of form of love bombing. That the group is, you know, it's being explained that you have this special status, which of course in Buddhism would not really be proper. But
no,
let's not worry about that.
Yeah, I think it was a sign that if people were willing to give up their careers, which I never said I would do, but for this, then it must be, you know, that science is wrong. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that we held the ultimate truth. And I also found that people flattered me a lot about my looks, much more than in the outside world. So in the NKT, they believe that if you are attractive, you must have done good things in a previous life. And there's also the sexualization of the deities. So even the women sort of told me that I was hot more than was kind of comfortable for me, shall we say. There was and people would often like grab my waist or it was quite a strange experience with how they deal with people's physical appearance, given that they're supposed to be sort of focusing on how people don't exist inherently and their bodies are empty of inherent existence. It's quite weird, the dynamic there.
And there are a couple of notions in there. Firstly, the notion of deities, which is completely foreign to the Buddha Dharma. There are no deities in the teaching of the Buddha. He said if the gods were enlightened, they would not be trapped in this universe. The notion that's come along of making deities out of bodhisattvas, again, not an idea that the Buddha taught. The bodhisattva is a later idea. But the emphasis upon, your physical birth, your karma has led you to this. That the Buddha there is more talk about caste in the Digha Nikaya than any other topic, and it amazes me that in talking to Buddhists they're unaware of this. The Buddha was very much against the idea that you were born with a status. So this is, it is whatever it is, but it is not pure Buddhism.
Well, it's interesting when you first arrive, because they don't sort of push the magical thinking on you immediately. That comes in slowly, bit by bit. And it's interesting because there's always a little bit of an element of truth that feels real to you, but then there's the magical bit on top, and you're kind of like, well, I'll leave the magical bit, but I quite like the sentiment, so that was how I dealt with it. So, for example, the teaching that all living beings have been your mother in some previous life and therefore you should be grateful to them. I never believed that to be true, but...
It's mathematically impossible.
Yeah, but it's somehow, because of all the emotional contagion and the bliss and the beauty and the purity being spoken about all the time, and... I started to find sort of sentimental things that I liked in the teachings, like how well, could I treat someone as if they were my mother? That's quite, So there was a lot that made me uncomfortable, but what they say is, well, it's like a bookshelf. You just take off the bit that you want for now, and you leave the rest. And you never know, one day you might take another bit off. But there's also this kind of subtle suggestion that you've got a lot of obstructions, really. And bit by bit, you will take on the ultimate truth. At first, it's not like I was meditating, if you call it that, according to their practices for hours a day, because I had a full-time job and I was also trying to do things like get exercise and normal things, and I still had some friends outside the group, but you have to go to one class a week at least if you live there, and you also have to sort of help out on retreats and things like that, and then you end up going in the retreat session, you know. And I think my low mood at the time, I think I heard someone talk of it like if you're the sponge, or your brain is the sponge, and the teachings are like the water, and the practices and the group like the water. So my sponge, if you want to call it, was I was finding it hard to imagine building a happy life. Don't really like the word happy, but you know what I mean. A fulfilling life with lots of sort of friends in it, because I just
satisfying.
I was struggling to make new friends, and my friendship groups have been disrupted because of my emigration and coming back again. And so some of the teachings on suffering, I think it helps people make meaning out of their suffering at first, because it's like suffering is what brings you to the Dharma. And you know, the more we experience suffering, the more we learn we need to practice renunciation, because the disappointment teaches us that you know, there's no point grasping after things because they don't last, and you know, they disappoint. And
even NKT is illusory.
Yeah. So, and because I'd had, you know, an experience where I'd wanted a happy ending and it had gone terribly wrong, that kind of spoke to me as kind of a but it's almost like a just don't try at all, you know, because it's all pointless, it's all meaningless. And but in a way that makes you feel like those people who are still trying to build a fulfilling life in the world, the way that it's taught is almost like, aren't we dumb? You know, we've got ordinary minds that just grasp after worldly things, and those things can't possibly last, and they eventually disintegrate. So it's all an illusion. And I guess because I didn't have the energy to try again, and I couldn't cope with the feelings of being hurt again, that kind of spoke to me. And you know, you can't deny that things are impermanent, you know, so there's always a bit of the teaching that speaks to you, and it makes you, they're instructed to tell jokes that kind of make you laugh about the ridiculous nature of the human condition, and you can usually relate to them. You know, you do think, oh yeah, how silly, I thought that was going to be the answer, and then it just disappointed me like everything else, you know, aren't I dumb? And it can for some people feel like they're sort of coming home to truths that they were holding but they don't think about, you know, but then the magical bits kind of on top. So but then in time, you know, all the focus on suffering, how everything is suffering, it can really be very depressing. You know, it really can. You know, they would talk about how you might hear the sheep bleating in the field, and it might sound kind of cute, but actually if you think about their eternal suffering and being trapped in their body, and how they do, you know, like it's actually suffering. And there is some truth in a lot of it, but it's really, if you hold it in mind as much as they say that you should be holding it in mind, you would be depressed. So, and then I did become more and more isolated and engulfed.
Yes.
Just you know, because you're in the middle of nowhere. I had a car, lots of people don't, so I was not so isolated, and I was with other people during the day at work. But it does weird things to you being in an isolated place with a certain group of people for a long time. So it affected me much more than I could ever have imagined. You know, when I look back now, I think, you know, I'm really shocked. So people are milling around and they're kind of saying, you know, about how ridiculous life is, and how, they wish they could change their inner world and their mind. And at first, I think I found it a relief from my workplace, because working in eating disorders with body image, you get really tired of hearing about well, if my body was the way I'd like it to be, I'd be happy.
Yeah.
And so when I went back to the Buddhist centre, it kind of felt like a relief, because everybody kind of said the opposite. Like, well, if I could just change my mind about the way then I'd be happy. Which at first seemed like a relief, but now I see it as it's just the other extreme. You know, it's just saying that, and actually they had weird ideas about the body anyway.
For instance?
Well, I mean, like I said about how they sexualise, even though there's lots of repressed sexuality, but...
You said something before we started about people imagining having sex with deities.
Yeah, I mean,
which seems a very weird version of Buddhism to me.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't a highest yoga tantra practitioner, which is what they call that practice, and I can't sort of say what that's actually like. But when I read on the website of the NKT that it involves imagining embracing and then a sexual embrace with the
very
Buddha.
Hot deity.
Yeah, so
a sexual embrace with the Buddha.
Yeah.
Now there's a thought. The Buddha was celibate. I don't think he'd have liked that.
No.
He'd have found that a bit intrusive.
Yeah.
I mean, Tantra originally begins as a way of sublimating sexual desire, and it then bursts through in some of the Tibetan sects as this idea, and it's considered a very dangerous path, that you will now focus on rapid enlightenment, and the path to rapid enlightenment is through sexual practices. It comes out of Hinduism, and you learn karetso, which is that a man learns not to ejaculate, a woman learns not to have orgasm. There's an influence from Chinese Taoist techniques, and they have a very different view of sexuality to the Buddhists. They think it's a great thing. But this, for me, rather insidious practice develops, where sex, far from being, the central aspect of desire, as Freud and others would think, becomes something that is a vehicle that you can use to obtain enlightenment. And within the Tibetan sects, that's proved to be devastatingly dangerous, especially when Tibetan teachers started to catch AIDS in the late 1980s, because they don't need protection, because they are spiritually so pure. Yeah. And that's a deception that's been hidden from the public ever since.
Yeah, and I have had people tell me that tantric ideas have been used to engage in sex with nuns by the monks, perhaps vice versa, I don't know, that people later identify as sexual exploitation and abuse, but sadly there aren't enough testimonies of that yet. Luckily, nobody ever... I'd say there was pressure to take highest yoga tantra initiation, or whatever they call it. I can't remember now. I didn't. But lots of people said that they did feel pressured to go to the empowerments and things like that.
Empowerment.
Yeah. So then... slowly over time, I'm becoming more... I'm feeling some of the kind of blissful feelings, shall we say. Like, I remember I was driving through the countryside and I was playing the prayer some of the different prayers in my car, and they're awful. They're really, they're in English, they're monotonous, the tone is weird, they try and fit too many words into each sentence. It's a really strange thing to do, but some of it, for some reason, I found it beautiful. Some of the sentiment.
Some people like Bob Dylan's voice. What can you say?
Yeah, I just liked... I liked feeling as if I was part of something bigger than me, and part of something, bowing down to something bigger than me, which I'd never been a religious person, so that was a totally new experience for me. And all the talk about the amazing energy and the positive minds that have been generated, and all of that did influence me. And I also liked the shared silence, and I do miss shared silence.
I went to a Quaker meeting.
Yeah, I mean, I felt valued as an introvert in a way that I hadn't been valued before. Like I could just be there and I didn't really have to do anything entertaining or crack jokes or, you know, perhaps share my real self, which maybe I wasn't feeling very comfortable doing at that time. Yeah, and so there weren't really... I saw that there were vulnerable people living there, but you sort of think they're living there by choice that's completely well-informed at the time. So, and lots of people, even if you ask them, do you want to leave, they'd say no, you know. So, and when I was encouraged to report the abuse that I was receiving to the police, and I did so reluctantly, thinking, you know, what are they going to do? They sort of said, well, is anyone being held physically captive? And I said, well, no. You know, and lots of them, even if you tried to assist them to leave, they wouldn't. So, because...
Which brings us into coercive control.
Yeah.
And the reality in this country that since 2015, it's been an aspect of law that somebody can be controlled psychologically. The problem is that the law only extends to intimate relationships. So it's very easy to hold somebody in a prison of thought, I fear. And what was the abuse that you sought to report to the police?
Well, that was the defamation and everything that came later. It wasn't when I was living there.
Yeah, okay.
But, yeah, so...
And that does fall under the harassment law, you could tell the police, by the way.
It's only because of the fake identities that they said they couldn't do anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good enough.
But, yeah, so I saw that people were vulnerable, but because of all the talk about suffering bringing people to the Dharma and it being, you know, the medicine, and because of themselves being so convinced that they were receiving the medicine and practicing the medicine, I didn't at first sort of challenge that in my head. I was kind of like, well, you know, if they believe it's helping them, fantastic. You know, even if it's just placebo or whatever, fantastic, that's fine. Who am I to say that they shouldn't be doing that? And I had heard, you know, even through my profession, that meditation was good. You know, so I didn't know about potential risks associated with meditative practices. And
such as acute psychosis.
Yeah. So it just wasn't clear to me what the adverse effects could be. And since then, I've read a lot more, you know. So, and more is coming out about it, about the risks. So I just thought that I was practicing meditation, and I didn't know about thought reform. And they just tell you that it is the way to meditate, and that everything else that other people teach that they're saying is meditation isn't, you know.
We're the only way.
Yeah, and I guess I was just willing to sort of try. Like, I obviously hadn't got the relief that I wanted from the therapy that I did have, and I wanted to sort of be flexible enough to try things that weren't kind of recommended in clinical psychology, because again, you're told that, you know, well, this is, you know, ancient wisdom practice, and it just maybe hasn't got to psychology yet, some of it, but they'll get there, you know, they'll catch up. So and then, you know, sometimes we had a lovely time, you know, sometimes some of us did get on, and you would have random moments that were lovely.
You were talking about the experience of bliss, driving along in your car and listening to the chants, and that bliss experience is a very important thing. We both know Yuval Law and his work on awe. It's not the word I would have chosen, but I see where he's going with it. I think it's a good use. For me, the word is euphoria. And when I left Scientology in '83, you start looking to the things that they told you not to look at, if you like, the things that are taboo. So neurology, The brain is dismissed completely in Scientology. So I went and read Oliver Sacks' Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which really changed my perception of who people are and how we behave. That because somebody does crazy things doesn't mean they're crazy. It can mean that some part of their brain is not functioning. So that was useful. But the other thing that you're not meant to look at is hypnosis. Even though when Hubbard first launched his ideas in 1951, he talked a lot about hypnosis, and in fact said that to practice his stuff you needed to understand hypnosis, and that was all gone. And when I read basic descriptions of hypnotic states, euphoria was one of the ones that really stood out, that if you can relax somebody enough or get them into, I don't like the word hypnosis, I use the term guided imagination because it's accurate. If you can guide somebody's imagination, and we're doing that all of the time, the TV's doing it, books are doing it, we do it in conversation, we are imagining things. If you can guide somebody's imagination, and if you can sit them down and sit there still and quiet, get them to breathe deeply, you will actually induce a state of euphoria. And I think I was talking to a dear friend who is an excellent counsellor and works solely with former cult members. And we got into a little bit of conflict because her background is in Christianity. My background is in a therapy cult, which purports to be a religion and all sorts of things, but fundamentally it was you using many of the therapeutic methods that are employed by clinical psychologists, because he just picked up everything he could along the way. And indeed he influenced people like Fritz Perls. There's a very definite, he talks about how much, how great Ron Hubbard's work is, which is a bit weird. But so coming from a background where supposedly psychotherapeutic methods have been used, you'll see methods that are then being used elsewhere and you have a suspicion of them because you know that they will make the person feel better. But that's not really the objective of psychotherapy. Yes, the person should feel better, but it's not, hey, wow, I feel great now.
Yeah.
You want them to be able to actually deal with their problems, not bliss out and avoid them. And I fear that is a problem with many meditative groups, that you're actually dissociating from your feelings, and you're dissociating from your own reasoning, and therefore losing the locus of control, the centre of control in yourself.
I remember after coming back from a festival, which is quite intense, you're focusing on your wish to benefit all living beings several times a day. And there's a lot
particularly the ants.
Yeah, and there's a lot of the bliss stuff and the blessings that, they call it. So you're told, that this bliss is holy bliss, nectar-like and all of that. And I signed up to a load of stuff that I couldn't then follow through. And I spent quite a lot of my own personal money on training courses that I thought were going to allow me to help people. And so it kind of made me overwork in my job as a psychologist, as well as thinking that it was somehow linked to the Dharma. So, and now it's very clear to me that I was experiencing mania. But this is reframed when you're in the group as having a blessed mind. So if you have really strong urges to be a messiah, or to teach or to do good things, it's seen as because you're blessed. But now what I know about further, it does a lot to your brain, that you may think that you're acting in accordance with wisdom and compassion, but you're actually just manic.
Or hypermanic.
Yeah.